Welcome back to Unpacking Ideas, and thanks for joining if you're new here. Today we're going to be unpacking Purgatorio by Dante Alighieri. This is the second part of a three-part series we did on Dante's Divine Comedy, so if you've not listened to part one, be sure to go back and listen to that because we kind of pick up here where we left off there. And helping me unpack this piece again was Phil Kobosov. Phil, as I mentioned in the last episode, is the leader of the New York Mythology Group and a longtime student of the Commedia. We talked about a lot of stuff. We got into the origins of Purgatory, what parts are scripture versus what parts are Dante's inventions, the geography and laws of Purgatory, the 7 deadly sins, and more specifically, we zoomed in on the sins of pride, lust, and sloth, as well as talking about their counterparts, humility, love, and zeal. We discussed anti-purgatory, procrastination, misdirected love, and then Virgil's exit and Beatrice's entrance. This was, for me, my favorite part of the Commedia. I kind of procrastinated reading it myself for a while, but I'm really glad I did. This section is full of symbolism and themes around redemption and moral improvement. And like always, Phil did such a great job of adding context to help bring some of these ideas to light. So I hope you guys get as much out of it as I did. And now here it is, my conversation with Phil on Purgatorio. We're here for Purgatory, part 2.
Yay.
Yes, and it's been a couple of months. You were traveling around, and then I was just being slothful, I think. So I needed a bit of a kick in the butt. I knew as soon as we had a date on the calendar that, we would make it happen.
Well, it would be a shame to just get out of Inferno and not talk about all the good stuff that's ahead of us.
That's true.
Yeah.
And actually, the first time I read attempted to read the Divine Comedy, I finished Inferno and then I stopped. I just kind of lost some momentum. So I was like the people in Anti-Purgatory, just kind of
wandering around and wondering what to do next.
Waiting.
Yeah. Well, this is great because, as you mentioned, most people don't venture past Inferno, or they go straight to the end of Paradiso, and that leaves a huge gap in between. And it's really, as you probably found out as you were preparing for this, there's a lot in Purgatory that's so interesting and worth talking about, and probably relevant for us today in a lot of ways. And that's, I guess, what we'll try to focus on.
Yeah, no, it ended up being my favorite section. I ended up liking Purgatory the best.
All right.
Yeah. The thing I liked about Purgatory is there's kind of movement and there's kind of a journey upwards or a journey towards improvement. Maybe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Purgatorio, as you mentioned, is this dynamic place where you're not just stuck in this eternal state, whatever that happens to be, whether it's perdition or bliss. You're progressing, you're making changes, you are making progress as you climb the mountain. Yeah. And in that sense, it's very reflective of our life in general, as we hopefully are moving on an upwards trajectory. And so that's why I think it's so relevant, so interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe we can talk a little bit about the origins of Purgatory.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Let's do that. This is super interesting. So most religions have the concept of heaven and hell. The Christian religion, the Jewish religion, Egypt had this concept of heaven and hell with some pretty horrific punishments, and hell being torn apart by crocodiles and so on.
Okay, yeah.
There's also, the Chinese have a concept of heaven and hell. So that part is not surprising. But what's unique about this tradition of Purgatory is it introduces this middle sphere, middle kingdom, second kingdom, as Dante puts it, secondo regno. And where does it come from? What is the genesis of this idea? Interestingly, the Bible has precious little to say about purgatory.
Okay.
There's very, very little scriptural background for anything like this, at least in the official canon. Now, you have a lot of apocryphal works that serve as precursors to Purgatory, and these are mostly Christian apocrypha. You have things like the Book of Enoch or some of the early Christian literature there. But again, there's nothing really that says, here is this place where you are purged from your iniquities. And so traditionally, like the Russian Orthodox Church, or just the Orthodox Church in general, the Greek Orthodox Church, they have been reluctant to admit to a possibility of a third realm like Purgatory. They have not really gone that route. The Protestants do not believe that either. And so you have the Catholic Church, which is the only kind of denomination in Christendom that decided to buy this idea that there is actually this whole place, this whole middle section, if you will, this holding cell, whatever you want to call it, like that keeps souls in between death and the last final judgment. And so in this period, what do? Right? You're kind of in between. So you need to do something. And so you have various Christian authors, starting from, I think Tertullian is the first one in 2nd century AD. According to my notes here, you have somebody called Evagrius Ponticus in 4th century AD. They just make certain intimations about this, but really nothing until you get to 11th or 12th century AD, so really close to Dante, where you have some official sanctions of Purgatory. And I believe it was one of the popes, maybe 100 or 200 years before Dante, that kind of officially sanctioned this idea that there is this holding realm where souls are either tried or they undergo some sort of cleansing or some kind of penitence. And it ties back with the idea that, in fact, you can pray for those souls while they're there to kind of speed up their progress. And Dante, of course, picks that up. But there is no description. What does it look like? Like, how is it organized? What is the landscape like? What is the logic of what goes on there? Right. So in one sense, and this is really amazing, Dante here is not just a poet. He's not just an author. He is a theologian. He's actually developing this whole doctrine, building out this whole doctrine of what Purgatory is. And he does it in a poem, but his poem becomes almost like the basis of Catholic dogma, which is kind of amazing, right? When he's not a pope, he's not an archbishop, he's not a clergyman at all, and yet his ability to paint this amazing picture is so powerful that the church thinks, well, he must have been inspired in some way. It must be true. So,
well, and I'm curious if it's that, like, people are aware that this is kind of Dante's invention and still kind of accept it as, the divine teaching, or if, like, what I find a lot of times nowadays when you talk to people about their ideas about kind of the Christian hell or the Christian heaven, a lot of times they are kind of inserting things that appeared in, like, Dante's Inferno, and they're just assuming that was what was written in the Bible. So I guess my question is, I'm curious if it's like, when you say Dante is a theologian, is that like people know that these are Dante's inventions and it's accepted, or people are just like not even aware that these are Dante's inventions? They've just kind of been accepted into this kind of idea of what Christians believe, or what appears in the Bible.
I think it's the latter. I think most people are not aware about the exact delineation of what's, quote, scriptural versus what is brought in from outside.
Yeah.
I think in general, and again, I'm not a specialist on Catholic doctrine, but my sense is that Catholicism in general its philosophy is bringing in as much, or accreting as much doctrine as possible if it's helpful. So in general, it has, accumulated a lot of different teachings from, the early fathers, the apocryphal writings, different decrees by different popes, right? So so Catholic dogma is more dynamic in that sense because it keeps bringing in additional things from the outside. And so Dante is just another one of these little branches that is grafted onto the tree of Catholic doctrine because it's proved to be so powerful. And again, I'm guessing, this is a guess, that because his depiction had such force and such sense of such authenticity, that the thinking was, well, it was divinely inspired.
Gotcha. Well, and maybe we can transition a little bit into kind of like the geography of Purgatory and kind of how it's set up. Because this, again, in our first conversation, you had kind of told the story about Satan's fall and how, there's the idea that when Satan fell, he kind of like imploded on Earth and caused this giant crater, which formed hell. And then the opposite side of the Earth was kind of displaced and formed this mount of Purgatory. And this is kind of what shows up here. We have this like actual mountain that the pilgrim is climbing.
Correct. So this is, again, this is such an interesting invention. Again, there's nothing in the Bible at all except for the fall of Satan. So Dante takes that premise, which is a real thing. I think in Isaiah, there's this little passage about Lucifer falling from heaven to earth. Again, it's not clear whether it's a physical fall or really more of an allegorical event. But in any case, Dante takes that as his poetic license and creates this actual physical landscape out of it. And yes, you have the implosion and you have the depths of hell being formed from that. And Lucifer himself is stuck there and in this frozen state. This is where we left off last time.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, presumably in the southern hemisphere, opposite of Jerusalem, it formed this fall and this implosion forms this mountain, and it creates the geography of Purgatory. And the mountain is organized just like hell in these circular terraces with some important differences. So I don't know if you want to go into that.
Let's talk about that. Yeah, so in hell, we kind of had these like 9 circles of hell. In Purgatory, we have these 7 terraces. But then we also have like, I guess, technically 2 more terraces that are not quite Purgatory. They're called anti-Purgatory, but maybe we could talk about the terraces and like why they are in the order that they are and
absolutely. Yeah. So the picture that Dante paints is you have this mountain that's rising towards heaven. And just like Inferno, there is a very definite geography that is logically connected with what's happening there. So you start out at the lowest level, which is, like you mentioned, the anti-Purgatory, kind of like a waiting hall, if you will, for the late penitent and people that have waited for the last minute to repent, or those who were killed and didn't have a chance to repent, or the excommunicated. So you have people that are saved but are not worthy to start the ascent at that time. They need to spend some time, I guess, thinking about their delay and their lack of zeal and so on. And then you get up to the actual gates of Purgatory, which is the area that starts Purgatorio proper, and that is a series of these concentric terraces that go up. And unlike hell, where you start out with the lightest sins and you proceed down to the most offensive, evil sins. With Purgatory, it's inverted, where you start out with the most serious, and as you climb higher, you get purified from lesser and lesser evils as far as God is concerned. So this is all, again, according to Dante, right? Yep. Because, again, in the Bible, since we're talking about the 7 terraces and the 7 deadly sins, which kind of correspond to these terraces and the cleansing in each one, in the Bible, there is not really a definitive list of 7
deadly sins,
7 sins or anything like that. I mean, there are lists, but they don't correspond to this one. That's the interesting part. There's a list in Proverbs, but it lists totally different things, and some of them,
which again, I'm sure a lot of people
don't know.
I didn't know that before. Yeah,
right. So in the Bible, there's not a list that corresponds to this one. Now, I mentioned earlier Tertullian and Evagrius Ponticus, they actually were not connected to Purgatorio. They were connected to the origin of this list that we see in Dante. And again, that list was not static. It kept changing. Once we get to Pope Gregory the First, this is 6th century AD, he has a list that's pretty much the same as Dante. So that list now has become canonical.
Okay.
And it's then further echoed by Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologiae, which is kind of the major work that Dante references in all of his geographies, both of hell and of heaven and of Purgatorio.
Okay. Yeah.
So this list is, again, an invention of not necessarily in the Bible, but it is roughly correspondent with the sins of Inferno. So the idea is, okay, here are the destructive behaviors in Inferno. It's not enough just to stop doing them. They have a certain effect on you while you're on earth. And so we need to have a way to cleanse ourselves and to overcome these, whatever you want to call them, deficiencies of character, weights, different character flaws, right? So things that are holding us down in one way or another. So there's a definite correspondence between Inferno in that sense and Purgatorio. The difference being, of course, like you mentioned, in Inferno, you're stuck. There is no improvement. There's nothing. There's no movement. In Purgatorio, there is movement and there's constant improvement. And very importantly, there's also a clear way to victory. And like you will never be left behind in Purgatory forever. So there's no way to actually fail. Like you're guaranteed to win. You've already won. Okay. Now you're just on your way to final victory, if you will. And so there's that very, very hopeful atmosphere in Purgatory, even though there's still some punishments, even though there's still some discomfort and even sighs and lamentations, but it's not at all the tone of Inferno, which is hopelessness.
Yeah, there's optimism here because, like you said, all the souls will eventually get to paradise. It's just kind of a matter of how long that process takes. The other thing I wanted to kind of ask that and follow up, you said we were kind of comparing the kind of punishments in Inferno with the so-called punishments in Purgatorio, and I think at first glance you can kind of look. When you're reading these, they read kind of similar, they're both being punished. But my interpretation was in Inferno, it's more of a kind of like, what are the two types of like justice? There's the idea of like you.
Retributive and reforming.
Exactly. Yeah. So I got the sense that like Inferno is more of like a retributive justice, where it's like the goal is to punish, whereas in Purgatorio maybe the goal is it's not just punishment for punishment's sake. It's more of to reform the soul in order to kind of cleanse them and get them to paradise. Is that a right way to think about it?
I think that's accurate. I think that's accurate. And I didn't know this too. I recently read somewhere that in the Catholic doctrine, there are three aspects to repentance. So one is confession. You have to admit, first of all, that you have a problem, which makes perfect sense to me in a kind of larger context, regardless of whether Catholic or not. Second part is contrition, right? You have to repent. You have to show that you're sorry for what you've done, contrition. And the second one is satisfaction. And the satisfaction is, okay, you've done wrong, so something has to happen with that satisfaction part. And there has to be something negative to kind of help you on your way to the positive. And that part is certainly emphasized in Inferno. That's the only part that's in Inferno. There is no contrition. There is no confession. There's just satisfaction, right, of God's justice.
Right.
But in Purgatorio, the emphasis really is on the other two, the confession, the contrition, and then satisfaction is not in a sense of being punished to satisfy some divine requirement of justice, because that would never work, because the punishment for sin is hell.
Yeah.
But really, it's more about the satisfaction is in terms of, in order to see God, you have to be pure.
Yeah.
And so we need to get you pure so that we can send you on your way. That's the sense of satisfaction that I get from reading it. And it makes sense psychologically to me as well. And again, I look at this work not just as some sort of religious poetry, but I try to look at it from a wider perspective of, okay, what does it tell us about living a good life? Because I think Dante is firmly in that tradition. He mentions it himself, that the anagogical level of interpretation of his work is to take people from the state of destructive behavior and help them lead a better life, and a life that is full of beauty and art and love. Yeah. And really, this work is about love and correcting not just certain habits or whatever, but it's reorienting your desires. That's what's really, to me, so intriguing about this, because it's not just about the lists of do's and don'ts. It's trying to reorient you so that you actually want to do the right thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a really interesting and different project than just saying, well, here are some 10 commandments and a list of do's and don'ts. Really, how do you get those commandments so that you actually want to do them, or you want to live a particular type of life that you yourself are satisfied with the type of person you are? Right? Yeah. Because really, I mean, Inferno is full of people that probably are not best friends or the best people that you want to associate yourself with. In Purgatorio, the sense is very different. The people that you meet in Purgatorio are really, I don't want to say nice, but they are becoming nice or nicer. And they're really like humble, and they realize their faults. And they're the kind of people that maybe you want to be with or become yourself.
Well, I like that you brought up humility too, because I think when we're kind of comparing and contrasting Inferno with Purgatorio, that's another thing that really stuck out to me is the attitude of the sinners in Inferno was like, either like I didn't do anything wrong or it wasn't my fault, no responsibility taken, where in Purgatorio, as we see when we start going through it, like most of the sinners are at least accepting, like, yeah, I was wrong here, or, I could have done better, and are kind of trying to reform.
Yeah, to me, the most striking example of that, and maybe we're jumping a little bit ahead, but the most striking example of that is when we meet people with artistic bent, really talented people, and we all know them. We live in New York, so we associate with people that are really like talented, smart, distinguished people. And one thing that you kind of tend to notice about them is a lot of times they're very arrogant, because they're smart and they know they're smart, and so they think of themselves as a little bit above everyone else. What's so refreshing in Purgatorio is when we meet these master craftsmen, like famous poets, artists, and one of them says to Dante, yes, I was the creator of these illuminated manuscripts, but this other guy is actually better than me. And he says it without any kind of without any sort of pang of envy, like or
false humility,
and it's so refreshing in one sense, because it's hard to see that in real life, but when you do, it is quite something. And so I think Dante, who himself is part of this group, he himself is very talented, and I think he struggles with that, because lots of times we read in between the lines, he thinks of himself as like the next big thing.
Oh yeah.
So that comes through as well. So it's really interesting to read about this idea of cleansing from that and kind of leaving all of that vanity behind.
Absolutely. Well, let's do this. Maybe let's start going through some of these cantos. I'm sure we'll circle back to, talking about some of the analysis and like the laws of Purgatory and how it all works. But let's just start going through some of the cantos. So I'm just going to read the first couple of stanzas of Canto 1 in Purgatorio. And kind of where we'd left off. Dante and Virgil had just climbed the stairs out of hell and kind of arrived on the shores of Purgatory. So here we go. Quote, "For better waters now the little bark of my indwelling powers raises her sails, and leaves behind that sea so cruel and dark. Now shall I sing that second kingdom given, the soul of man wherein to purge its guilt, and so grow worthy to ascend to heaven. Yours am I, sacred muses, to you I pray. Here let dead poetry rise once more to life, and here let sweet Calliopea rise in play. Some fair accompaniment in that high strain, whose power the wretched Parides once felt so terribly they dared not hope again. Sweet azure of the sapphire of the east was gathering on the serene horizon its pure and perfect radiance, a feast. To my glad eyes, reborn to their delight, as soon as I had passed from the dead air which had oppressed my soul and dimmed my sight. The planet whose sweet influence strengthens love was making all the east laugh with her rays, veiling the fishes which she swam above.
Beautiful.
Beautiful, yeah. And a lot of symbolism around rebirth, renewal.
I would say the emphasis here is also on, again, just the Dante's project of synthesizing the classical tradition with the Christian. And right away here we see his appeal to the muses, which is something totally customary in Roman and Greek poetry, right? You have, of course, we have Virgil as our guide still, and the Aeneid starts exactly with that same type of invocation to the muses. Homer does that. I mean, all of the classical authors start with that type of appeal, and Dante follows suit. So he says, I am continuing in that tradition.
Yeah.
One little quick point I want to make here is as Dante and Virgil climb out, keep in mind they're climbing out in the southern hemisphere. So the stars that they see are not the stars that Dante knows anything about, presumably, because this is way before Magellan, right? Nobody has ever seen the southern hemisphere in Europe, and yet he knows about the Southern Cross, the 4 stars of the Southern Cross. And this is in the verses just after what you've read, verse 28. After my eyes took leave of those 4 stars, and so on and so forth. This is one of those really interesting mysteries in the Commedia. How did Dante know about the Southern Cross? Not having traveled there.
Yeah.
So one interesting theory is that Marco Polo, who had returned to Venice a few years before Commedia was written, potentially had seen the Southern Cross in his travels. He possibly had gotten as far as beyond the equator, or at least far enough to see the Southern Cross. And so he possibly described this to someone who described it to Dante. That's one theory, which is super interesting.
That is cool.
Again, it's just one of those little tidbits that makes reading this so exciting, because there's all sorts of unresolved mysteries in the text, and it makes it kind of rewarding to keep your eye out for these things, because not everything is known. Like, we don't know a lot of things about what something means in the Commedia. There's a lot of these sort of hidden areas and trails and rabbit trails that are still unresolved. Absolutely.
Well, and on the topic of stars as well, we kind of see these stars throughout Purgatorio, and one of the footnotes I remember seeing, the stars, they go from being 4 stars to being 3 stars, and the symbolism that the footnote was saying that's meant to, the 4 stars represent kind of the classical virtues,
right,
and the 3 stars represent the Christian virtues.
Correct.
So there's that kind of, as we kind of ascend Purgatorio, there's the kind of transition from classical to Christian virtues.
Yes, there's definitely that. And Virgil, who is a paramount teacher and leader in Inferno, is certainly gradually taking more of a background role, and his guidance and leadership is not as strong in Purgatorio, which is probably by design, because Dante wants to show that even though classical tradition has a lot of value, and that's a big part of his project. I mean, he borrows all sorts of things from the Aeneid and from classical authors.
Yeah.
But his point is that even though the classical tradition does have a huge value, it is not sufficient in itself to lead a person to full knowledge or full vision of the divine. And so that's why Virgil's influence certainly starts to wane towards the end. And then, of course, Virgil leaves, and we're left with Dante and Beatrice. So there's definitely that.
Great. Well, and then the other thing that happens in these first couple of cantos is we meet Cato here. And like we mentioned the first conversation as well, he's kind of an unlikely person to meet because he was a pagan. He was also a suicide. So there's kind of the question, why is Cato the guardian of Purgatory?
Absolutely.
And then I guess the other thing that kind of stuck out to me is there's a little bit of a jam session here that happens in, I believe, the second canto, where Dante meets one of his old friends, on Earth, and they start playing some music. And Cato kind of comes over and scolds them, just like, put that guitar away, basically. And I got the sense that the message there is that, like, Purgatory is like, you're here to work. Like, this is a kind of spiritual boot camp. Like, once you get to heaven, it can be kind of all just fun and games. But, like, I don't know, is that a kind of proper analysis or proper way to think about it? Or I guess, how did you think about that sequence?
I thought of it more in terms of emphasis on leaving earthly things behind.
Okay.
Because you're on your way to see God. And so the conflict there, the tension there is between earthly delights and earthly relations, and spiritual delights and new spiritual relations. So Casella is somebody that Dante knew on earth, and Casella sang those Canto l'amoroso, the songs of love that Dante loved so much. But that was back home.
Okay.
And we're not back home. We're not in Kansas anymore. So we need to reorient ourselves. And like you said, we're here to work. So that, I think there's that aspect. But the other aspect is that there is constantly a reorientation of your gaze and your priorities, right? So the rebuke of Cato is not so much, hey guys, let's work. It's more like, okay, why are you still looking back and thinking that whatever enjoyment you derived on earth is less than what you're going to get here? You're actually like, there's much more happening here that you should be paying attention to, instead of looking back and reminiscing to the earthly scene.
Right. I guess in that sense, their kind of jam session was like, oh, let's kind of play this old song like the good old days, and kind of there's some nostalgia there, some looking back.
Right. And again, it kind of is, in some ways, I have to be honest, it is kind of jarring a little bit, like, dude, like, what's wrong with just a little, I haven't seen this guy in a long time, I've been in hell, can't we just, like, can't you just relax and let us have a little, like I said, a little jam session? But the import of that, I think, is that, again, that's, what is that going to do? That's going to focus you on things that were, as opposed to things that are about to happen. And that's the problem. In other words, you're here, your gaze, your attention, your focus. And again, Dante is all about psychology. I mean, this work is like a masterful exposition of human psychology. And so psychologically, if you're thinking about your old buddies and the good old times, you're not going to be thinking about the divine, the ultimate vision. So, like the common saying, the good is the enemy of the perfect. Yeah. Or sometimes I guess people say the perfect is the enemy of the good, but in this case, the good is the enemy of the perfect, the ultimate. You could be stuck with something good and humanly acceptable, but from a divine perspective, it's the second best.
Right.
And so,
well, and I guess it's kind of foreshadowing to, we'll obviously talk more about Beatrice when we get there, but she does kind of chastise Dante, and a lot of what she's chastising him for is kind of wasting so much time pursuing things other than God. I mean, and basically like chasing kind of false ideals. At least that's kind of what I got. And maybe this is an example of that, even here in Purgatory.
I think so. I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right there.
Cool. Well, let's maybe move on to this, the terraces of anti-purgatory, and just touch on that a little bit. This is where we see a lot of the kind of late repentant and the people that were they did end up kind of repenting or kind of converting to Christianity, but they dragged their feet a bit. They waited to the last minute in a lot of cases.
Correct.
So the symbolism there is, you took so long on earth to repent and to convert to Christianity. Now you're going to have to wait to get into heaven, or to even wait your ascent up the mount. And you're kind of in this anti-purgatory place here.
Yeah, and there's some pretty strict math about how long you have to wait to be in this kind of wandering around and not really making a whole lot of progress. And it has to do with how long you waited and whether or not you were excommunicated or you were in just basically in denial of God and so on. And so you have this, like, if you were excommunicated, I believe for each year of excommunication, you have 30 years in purgatory to spend in this holding pattern. Which, by the way, this is where we also get introduced to the idea of praying people into heaven, which is the idea that if you have people on earth that are interceding for you, that can speed up your progress. And so this doctrine obviously did not originate with Dante, but he definitely validates it in his poetry. And so you have this repeatedly, this appeal for prayers for those who are deceased to help them along the way.
Well, and we see Manfred here, and he's one of these people who, I think he actually tells Dante, like, hey, when you finish this journey and get back to Earth, like, I think it was his sister or somebody, he's like, tell my sister to pray for me so that I can kind of speed up my process throughout here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess he was one that I think he converted to Christianity, like, I think in the last minutes of his life, right? Right. That was the thing. And again, it's kind of better than nothing, but still leaves something to be desired. So you're kind of at the bottom of purgatory if you're in his situation. Right.
And again, this is if we take it from kind of the religious context, like, okay, it's basically procrastination.
Yeah.
Right? You know the right thing. You know what you need to do. You know you need to go on this diet. You know you need to do whatever, but you don't do it. And so you're procrastinating. And what happens when you procrastinate? Well, you don't make any progress, for one.
Yeah.
Right? That's the kind of the obvious implication here, is that the longer you procrastinate, the longer it's going to take you to make any progress. Now, I use dieting as an example because everybody seems to be on a diet, and there's this epidemic of obesity around the world. Well, the longer you maintain bad habits of whatever, not exercising and so on, guess what? It's going to take you longer to catch up. I mean, there's this, it's almost like you reap what you sow type of relationship, right? So there's a proportionality in procrastination of doing something that you know is the right thing to do versus the effect.
For sure. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, this is actually where I fell off reading the committee the first time. So the irony is not lost on me. I was procrastinating and I kind of lost that momentum.
Right.
And to that point too, because I fell off and kind of lost that momentum, it took a lot more energy, a lot more time to get the ball rolling again and kind of get back into the swing of...
Wow, you're really identifying with the purgatory.
Yeah, I guess I identify with some of these people in anti-purgatory here. Well, yeah, and then we move to the official gates of purgatory, which, as people probably remember from the first conversation too, we have several cantos before we get to the official gates of hell as well. So there's some symmetry here between the canticles in terms of it's not as if right when Purgatorio starts, you're in purgatory. There's kind of a lead up to it. And we're almost a third of the way through, and we're only now getting to the actual official gates of purgatory. Yeah, and we also, when we kind of get to the gates of purgatory, Dante walks up these 3 steps. There's a white step, a green step, and a red stair, which... we have kind of white representing faith and purity, green representing hope, and red representing love. At least that was kind of the interpretation that I read. And these, again, are kind of fill-ins for the 3 Christian virtues as well. So there's just a lot of this symbolism here that we're moving more and more towards the Christian virtues.
Absolutely. And then I guess we should talk about the 7 Ps, right?
Yeah.
So as Dante enters Purgatorio, his forehead is inscribed with the 7 Ps, letter Ps for peccata in Latin. That's Latin for sin or sins. And as he is going to ascend through different terraces in Purgatorio, these peccata are going to be erased one by one until he reaches the very end. Final P is going to be erased, and then he will be ready to proceed and meet Beatrice.
Yeah, and just another thought about the sins, because as he, like you said, as he ascends, the P's get erased from his forehead, but he also, after each P is erased, he actually feels lighter, like physically lighter. And there's this mention throughout all of Purgatory that as they ascend the mountain, the climb gets easier. Like it's very hard in the beginning. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of dig into the psychology of that, because I think that's a really interesting idea. I guess the way I interpreted it is that basically, you mentioned like the diet, like a diet's very hard in the beginning, but once you kind of get in the swing of things, it gets easier. I guess, is that the same idea that like, as you kind of rid yourself of these sins or these vices, the subsequent vices become easier and easier to kind of get rid of? Is that a bit of the idea of the symbolism there? Or
I believe so.
Okay,
I believe that's correct. And yeah, I totally agree with your assessment there. The hardest thing is to get started.
Yeah.
As you get started, the climb gets easier. And as you have a certain momentum, right? It's almost like the inertia, right?
For sure.
If you're stationary, the hardest thing is to move from 0 to 1.
Yeah.
Once you're on your way, the next steps are easier and easier. Also, it should be mentioned that the way Purgatorio is organized, things that Dante considers to be the harshest and the hardest sins to overcome are first. So as you overcome those, the climb gets easier because you leave those, you cleanse from the harshest, the most punishing, the most weighing down things behind. You're leaving them behind, and so the climb gets progressively easier as you move to lesser offenses, essentially.
Makes sense. Well, and that's a good kind of transition to talk about the first terrace here. Then this first sin is of that of pride, and I found this one the most interesting, I think, partially just because the medieval conception of pride is quite different than our modern conception. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit. First, what Dante means by pride, and I guess, again, like, why is pride considered the worst of these 7 deadly sins?
Right. So in Latin, pride is superbia. You can probably guess the origin of, or the etymology of that. Super means above. Superbia means you are considering yourself to be above someone else.
Yeah.
And, if we think about the original sin, not the one that Adam committed, but the sin of Lucifer, is he put himself above the divine. I mean, this theme is actually common not just to the Christian tradition, but also to the classical tradition, where you have the battles or the challenge of authority of Zeus by the Titans and other characters, like even Prometheus. You can think of him as challenging Zeus's authority. And every time this challenge is considered as something terrible, as something that is upsetting the order in the world in some way. Prometheus, you can probably argue about that one, but the Titans are easier to trace. They're just destructive types of beings, and they revolt and they cause all sorts of upheavals. So Zeus is this figure that represents rightful authority. Let's just assume that it's rightful for the moment.
Yeah.
So the sin of pride is where you put yourself above authority. You're saying, I'm above whatever laws of man or laws of God or whatever, and that's really the essence of it. And so, of course, you cannot proceed if you're in that state where you think yourself as being above any kind of law or rule or anything that you need to submit to, and this idea of submission probably is critical, then you can't really proceed anywhere else.
Right, like you're kind of above the rules.
You're above the rules, so you're just like running around doing whatever you want, kind of like the Nietzschean Superman, or just doing whatever Ubermensch, doing whatever you want and trampling down the weak and the strong and so on.
Yeah.
So if you're in that state, then there's not much going on as far as improvement of your life.
Yeah.
I mean, more power to you, but you're probably going to self-destruct at some point very quickly.
Right. So you're kind of putting yourself and like you're the center of the universe.
Correct. And imagine if everybody lived that way, right?
Yeah.
Imagine if not just one person, but if everyone in society all of a sudden decided that they're going to be the center.
Everyone's a narcissist.
Everyone is a narcissist. And thank God we have some ways to control each other's narcissism, because if it wasn't for that, then, it would be literally dog-eat-dog type of world, not very pleasant.
Yeah.
The opposite of that is you realize that you need to submit. And again, maybe submission to authority we kind of balk at, especially in American culture, like nobody wants to submit to anything. Mm-hmm. But we need to submit to each other's authority in a sense, because in a society you have to limit your desires for the sake of keeping the community, right? That's the real point. And so all the other virtues really, they're all built on top of that foundation. Yeah, that's the prerequisite, right? It's like in college, you have to take prerequisites before you can move on. This is the prerequisite for everything else, because if you don't pass that, you don't proceed anywhere else. Because why would you, right? All the other sins. If you think your own appetites and desires are number one, then why would you not be a glutton? Or would you not be a lustful person? Why would you not be greedy and so on? And I think part of the problems we face today in our culture is that understanding that used to be a common sense thing, I think is lost. And instead we have kind of this childish portrayal of the world as each one of us is a little superhero running around doing whatever they want and doing whatever they can get away with, really. Yeah. But the problem is we don't get away from ourselves. Yeah. And those appetites are destroying, whether or not we get what we want, the appetites are going to make us the type of person that's going to eventually be very miserable and self-destructive.
Well, and this leads, I'm going to jump here a little bit, but when we get to like Canto 17, Virgil has a discourse about love and free will. And in it, he kind of explains a little bit about how purgatory is organized. Mm-hmm. And he talks about there's basically like three ways that love can go wrong. You have the kind of where the love is kind of misplaced or directed at the wrong thing, which would be the case with pride. Instead of your love being kind of directed at God or something beyond you, you're directing it as yourself. Like we said, you are kind of making yourself the center of the universe. Mm-hmm. And then the other ways, again, it's kind of foreshadowing, but the other ways is kind of excessive love, or what's the opposite of excessive? But like basically, not enough. So basically, there's the distinction between
the object and the degree.
Yeah, thank you. Perfectly said. Yeah, the object and the degree. So this is a problem in pride. This is a problem of the object of love being the wrong one. So maybe that's why it's more fundamental, because as we move up, the sins, they're going to at least have the right object in mind, but now it's just a matter of degree. So this is why there may be less severe sins once we get to the top of the mount of purgatory.
Yes, potentially, yeah. Although I would say that lust and gluttony and greed, they also have a misplaced object, right? You're really looking for things. But maybe it is both, right? Maybe it's both, because you have, first of all, you're misplacing the object, but then you have the degree is that, I mean, obviously we all need to eat, we all need to have sexual relations, we all need to have possessions, right? That's part of life. But the degree to which we the place that we allot to those different things, that could be obviously out of proportion. Yeah. So that's the degree part. But I agree with you that there's definitely that also object, and that's more serious.
Great. Well, and then the punishment for the prideful, they're carrying these huge boulders on their back, and the symbolism there is pretty obvious. They've been so kind of narcissistic and full of themselves that they're kind of now having to be smothered humbled, literally humbled,
bent
over,
bent down. That's a great sort of allegory of what pride does, because if you make yourself, I was thinking about this earlier, if you make yourself kind of, you puff yourself up, right?
Yeah.
You make yourself a big target. Like anybody can kind of prick your bubble and offend you, and you're so easy to be offended, right? The bigger you are, the bigger you make yourself out to be. But if if you consider yourself to be pretty small and kind of not that big of a deal, then you're good. Like you don't feel that weight of constantly having to defend your reputation or whatever. Absolutely. And all of that stuff, really, it's like it takes a toll. I mean, if you go through life constantly looking out for somebody to offend you, or looking out for anyone that dare not say something to you that's like, oh my God, beneath your dignity, then you're going to have you're not going to have a great time.
Right.
If you just live your life and kind of kind of chillax and take it easy on yourself, and not think of yourself in those like, I'm so great, I'm like this amazing person that everybody needs to be aware of all the time, how great I am, then it's okay.
Right. Well, and I guess the kind of positive examples we see here, the Virgin Mary and then King David, are kind of the examples Dante gives of people who were, acted with humility. And I saw a lecture on the Great Courses Plus. The lecture was talking about how in Mary's case, it might have been that, Mary is kind of the one that was chosen by God to, birth Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people in that circumstance might think like, oh, well, I must be really special because God chose me. But that wasn't Mary's response. She kind of instead chose to be like, oh, I'm, so honored and so humbled to be the servant here, and kind of, didn't take the kind of prideful attitude.
To build on what you just said, let's think about her circumstance for a second. She is told by God that she's going to be pregnant with this divine child. Yeah. But no one else is going to know about it. So from the outside, it looks like what? She got pregnant and not by her husband. Right. That's a very humbling circumstance. Especially in that time. I mean, a person that gets a child out of wedlock is considered like a castaway. Right. I mean, there's no future for that type of person. And of course, if you remember the Gospels, Joseph, when he saw that she's pregnant, I mean, he was ready to say, okay, goodbye. Yeah, right. So it was a very humbling experience. That's why she's an example of humility, because she agreed to have this humbling experience and be essentially called a prostitute or whatever, a whore, because she... Right. But yet she is the opposite of that. And that's let's remember all of that. And her response when she realized what's going to happen to her, because she's not going to have like angels running, dancing around her shoulders, saying to everyone, hey, this is a divine child. No, nothing like that happened. I mean, there was some angelic host. There was some of this showing of divine glory, but not to everyone. Well, and she's sacrificing her personal Absolutely. So that's reputation for something greater. Yeah. So that's why she's this prime example of humility, is because she is letting her reputation be essentially ruined because she realizes for this greater good. And so her response is, Ecce ancella Dei, behold the servant of the Lord. Yeah. Meaning, okay, let it happen. Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up, because I definitely wasn't seeing it through that lens, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. That's great. Well, let's, we're obviously not going to have time to go through all of these terraces, but I wanted to stop a little bit in the Canto 17 here, because this is where Virgil's discourse is on love. And we have these two types of love, natural love and rational love. So, do you want to kind of take the lead here on these kind of two types of love, what they kind of mean? I want to reference a couple of things. So, throughout Purgatorio, Dante talks about the nature of desire and how it connects to love. So love is just really an expression of desire. And there are several points that he makes through the mouths of people that he meets. So one of them is Marco Lombardo, and then we have Virgil, like you said, who is expounding this in the Terrace of the Sloth, kind of giving us the overall scheme of things. Yeah. So Marco Lombardo, he makes this point that what we do is not predicated on fate, first of all. So we have there's this idea of free will, and we're not hampered by heavenly bodies. We're not hampered by the astrological signs that we're born with, like horoscopes and things like that.
He wasn't into astrology.
Right. Well, no, but I mean, there's Dante
modern astrology.
Yeah, not maybe modern. Like, okay, so I'm a Leo, so I'm going to be prone to anger. I'm this, I'm going to be prone to this. No, you are whatever you are, and you're responsible for whatever you do with yourself. You might have certain influences, and I think the point that is made there is heavenly influences do not comprehend your entire personality.
Right,
they may affect your bodily appetites, maybe. And I think that might be totally valid, by the way. But they do not affect your ability to choose. They do not affect your intellect. And so you're still responsible for kind of navigating your life. So that's number one. The second part is the psychology of desire. And this is really, I feel like this is really good and deep analysis of, in general, how human beings work. And so Dante says that every creature has desires that are natural. And he says that nature doesn't make mistakes. Like, there's no error in desire per se. We all tend to fixate on certain things from our birth. And whatever we fixate on, if it's pleasing to us, then it's going to result in a desire to possess it in some way. Now, the issue is, what do we fixate on, number one? That's the object.
Yeah.
And the second one, do we fixate on it to the exclusion of everything else? In other words, it's the question of priority and the question of object, what's the object, like you mentioned, of what we choose. So nothing wrong with desire per se, but also nothing right about love per se either. So you know how all we need is love type of slogan. Well, but love of what? Right?
Yeah, right,
all we need is love, but love of what and of who? And so love in itself is not some sort of a justification for any type of atrocity. I mean, you can say that Hitler loved power.
Or loved himself.
Or loved himself. And so, okay, so does that justify his actions?
Yeah, right.
So love is both a wonderful and a terrible thing. It's just a kind of modus operandi of our life, right? Everybody has desires. Everybody loves something. That's inevitable and inescapable. But what is in our control is how we kind of direct the ship of desires. And part of Purgatorio is to show, in Inferno is to show the negative examples of what happens when you really fixate on something to exclusion of everything else, and how it destroys your life, like avarice or gluttony or whatever. Mm-hmm. But in Purgatorio, it's more about, okay, how do we cleanse it so that these desires are not weighing us down? They're not kind of out of proportion, essentially, of what's rightful and good.
Yeah.
And I think that's a major point that needs to be made, because you have other philosophies that, for instance, Buddhism, that would say that, okay, so the problem with human beings is desire, so let's just get rid of desire. Right? And I think that's one way to kind of approach it. I don't think it's really a great way, because as Dante shows, desire is fundamental to being human. So if you
he would just say desire the right things.
Yeah, he would say desire the right things and desire in the right proportion of everything else.
Yeah.
But not abnegate desire per se.
Yeah.
And that's kind of this. If I understand kind of the Buddha approach is that's the approach is, okay, let's just kill desire, period, and then we'll be fine, because we won't desire anything except for enlightenment. But that, again, I think that gets rid of our humanity and the richness of our experience. So I don't think that's a good approach. But approach that Dante recommends here is approach of, let's purify the desire. Let's sanctify it. Let's direct it. Let's put it in context of everything else, so that it's not deforming us and making us like some tree that is not growing straight, but growing in the crooked. And its growth is inhibited because certain things weigh it down from this side and certain things are weighing it down from that side.
Well, and one of the things you said when we were kind of talking before we started recording was that, if you are kind of able to purify yourself and get to the point where you are desiring the correct things, then it actually becomes a good thing to desire. And, by the time you get to Paradiso, desire is not a bad thing, because everybody's kind of desiring the quote unquote right things in the correct proportions.
To me, that is the most amazing statement in Purgatorio is where Virgil tells Dante, this is towards the end there, where it says, for you now not to do what you desire is sinful because you have been purified. So whatever now that you are been purified, whatever you desire, that's automatically a good thing. You need to follow it.
Yeah.
That's a great, that's the place where we want to get to. Like, so that we are, I don't know if that's realistic on this earth or not, but that's the ideal, is that, and that's the whole point of this earthly paradise, where Dante is in a place where whatever he wants to do is automatically the right thing to do. You don't even need to think about it. Just you can be guided by your desires. The point is to purify them to that degree.
It's such an interesting idea.
Let me see if I can find that exact passage, because I feel like that's such a fundamental...
take your time.
No worries. I think it's in 20... yes, this is Virgil speaking to Dante. This is as they are about to... or as they just passed through the fire, or about to pass through the fire, he says the following to him. I've brought you here through intellect and art. From now on, let your pleasure be your guide. You're past the steep and past the narrow paths. Look at the sun that shines upon your brow. Look at the grasses, flowers, and the shrubs born here spontaneously of the earth. Among them you can rest or walk until the coming of the glad and lovely eyes. This is talking about Beatrice. Those eyes that weeping sent me to your side. Await no further word or sign from me. Your will is free, erect, and whole. To act against that will would be to err. Therefore, I crown and mitre you over yourself. So this is the goal of the whole Purgatorio, is to get a person, Dante or anyone else, to a place where they are essentially in control of themselves. They're crowned, right? They're wearing a crown. Who are they a king of? Well, themselves. They're free because they're not weighed down by, pulled by specific character flaws, I would say. And let's think about it for a second. We talk about pride. What about anger? I know from my own experience, from other people's experience, anger can be a total handicap, right, to people. It can weigh them down. It can destroy their relationships with people that they're close to. It's such a destructive facet of our character. Imagine getting rid of that. Imagine being free from anger, or overcoming it as a habit, as a bad habit, as a thing that weighs you down. And all the other things the same way. All of these things, they are really preventing us from being in control of our own lives. And so when Virgil says, I crown you, that's an amazing statement. He is saying that Dante now is sovereign, and that's actually the word that he uses in Italian. I think it's sovra. So it's like sovereign, I crown. You're the sovereign now of yourself, your own life. And whatever you want to do, if you don't do what you want to do, that's sin. To not do against your will, which is free, erect, and whole. And erect there, it's dritto, straight. Like, remember when we started out in that forest, it was like we lost the straight way. Yeah. Now we've regained it. Yeah, we've regained that straight way, and now free to do what we want to do because our desires have been purified. We only desire to do the right thing. Now, whether or not that's true of Dante at that point in the poem is doubtful, because a few chapters later, he is going to say that he's going to be contrite and confess his sins to Beatrice. But one of the things he says there, he says, all the things that you've accused me of, I agree with, and they are now hateful to me. So I hate the things that I've done. I don't just admit they're wrong. I actually hate them with utmost hatred. So it's like a person who used to be a drunkard, but now hates to drink. He actually hates it. He doesn't have to. There's no they don't need to do anything. He just hates. He will never drink because he just hates doing it. Yeah. It's that idea.
Well, cool. So let's. I say we keep kind of ascending up the mount.
All right.
So at this point, we've kind of passed the terrace of wrath and the hoarders and the wasteful, which again, we don't really have time to go through all of these, but that one's pretty self-explanatory. Gluttons, then the lustful, which, as you kind of mentioned, this was the circles are kind of inverse to the way that they were in Inferno, where lustful was among the first circles of hell, and now here in Purgatory, it's one of the last circles or the last terraces.
Right.
And this is the kind of final P that Dante has to kind of shed from his forehead before he can be fully purified and make it into Paradiso.
Right.
So is there anything we want to say about this circle of lust before we talk about what follows it?
Just that it's interesting to me, the contrapasso there, that they have to, that the penitents are greeting each other with a kiss, but it's, it's a holy kiss, right? Just like in church, people hug and kiss each other, but it's not sensual. It's not, in other words, it's affection that's, so it's almost giving them this chance to experience a world where love and affection could be of, I guess, non-sexual character. Not everything has to be sexual, right? Not everything has to be necessarily of that type of relationship. So it's it's a different dimension of love, and yet that's such an important part of life, and such a a rich part of friendships. Let's just let's think about that. I mean, David and Jonathan in the Bible are like a prime example of that, of this beautiful friendship that has nothing to do with sexuality. It's just like they love each other. They're like so. They're just great friends. They just best friends ever.
Right.
And yet it has nothing to do with, like, today. Almost anytime you have that, it's like, oh well, they must be like gay or something. No, they're not gay. They just click.
Yeah.
They're like they are what's the word? Soulmates. Right.
Yeah.
Non-romantic soulmates. They complete each other. And when Jonathan perishes, David is like part of him dies, and that's the kind of relationship they have.
Yeah, no, I like that. I didn't get that from the reading, that the souls here, their kind of sin was that they were lustful, and so you're saying the kind of punishment or the way to kind of correct here in Purgatory is to have basically like a more platonic relation to the opposite sex, or I guess whatever object that they were directing that lust towards.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, lust is about getting what you want, right? Versus love is actually doing something for the other person. I mean, that's the difference. The lust, like when you lust for something, you want something for yourself, which is, by the way, perfectly fine within certain confines. We talk about degrees, right? So to a certain degree, that's perfectly natural and normal. Like we all desire food, sex, whatever, clothing, and so on. What's not right is when you make that kind of the only guiding principle in your life, and it gets out of control. And you can do that with relationships, and you can kind of use people, right? You use people for your own ends. To put it in the Kantian terms, like you use other people as ends for you, as opposed to treating other people as ends in themselves. Yeah, right. Everybody has a right to be kind of a little sovereign kingdom. And what you're doing is you're trying to breach that sovereignty and kind of use them for your own ends, without regard for their best, right? Yeah, that's the difference between lust and love ultimately. So what's happening in this terrace is they're exploring like this new dimension of a relationship that actually puts other people first, and that's what love is. It's putting other people first, above you, right? Again, almost going back to the pride where we started from. Superbia is putting yourself above everyone else. Love is putting other people, like, okay, my wife asked me to do something, I don't want to do it. Okay, I'll have a choice. I can either put my own, and again, you navigate it however you need to navigate it, but the point is that's really the dynamic in every single time. Yeah, that's great. Well, so then, once Dante makes it through this terrace, and he has the final P kind of burnt from his forehead, he's told to enter this wall of fire or wall of flame. And this is
one of his final kind of purifications, and he's initially like really scared to go through it. And Virgil goes through it with him as well.
And Statius, yeah.
And
and we picked up along the way. Yeah,
we forgot to mention Statius, but another poet that they pick up along the way, who's on his way to paradise. Yeah, and here, I don't know. There's a lot that kind of happens here, but. Do we want to talk about kind of Virgil's exit, Beatrice's entrance, and all of this?
Yeah, let's talk about him.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, Virgil and Statius and Dante come to this last wall of fires, the last terrace after of the lustful, and kind of the exit sign, right, which is the wall of fire, the final purgation, the final cleansing of all the dross and so on. So they need to pass through that to kind of complete this process. And Virgil goes first, and Statius, and then Dante, and they all pass through it. But at that point, we kind of get the sense that Virgil's time is now at an end.
Yeah.
And actually, we don't know exactly when he leaves, but there's a point at which Dante sees Beatrice, turns around to Virgil to say, "Oh, there's Beatrice," but Virgil is gone. Mm-hmm. He is departed. And he says, "Virgil, the sweetest father." Dolcissimo Patre, or something like that, in Italian. The sweetest father, the gentlest guide, is gone. And it's such a thing because, he's been there all along. He's been guiding Dante.
It's a touching moment.
It's a very, very touching moment and we know that he's never going to get saved. He's never going to, the whole thing is just heart-wrenching in some ways.
And you would think too that Dante's response to seeing Beatrice for the first time would just be ecstatic and overjoyed, but he's actually crying because he's like, Virgil's gone. So
he's crying, and then Beatrice says, "Don't cry. I'm going to make you cry in a second.
Yeah,
so
I'll give you some
tears. Yeah,
I'll give you something
to cry about."
Yeah. But yeah, I think there's a lot of symbolism there. I love that metaphor of the carrying the lantern. Yeah, or I guess another metaphor I think of is kind of like passing the torch. It's
passing the torch, yeah.
It's the idea that Virgil is never going to kind of make it into paradise, but his philosophy, his writing is kind of helping others to get there. So he's kind of letting them go where he couldn't go.
Right.
Which again kind of echoes back to our first conversation where we were talking about the beginning, a period in Christianity where there was this kind of debate what we should do with the with the classical authors,
right?
And the side that said, we can actually learn a lot from them, and kind of take the lessons and kind of adapt them. That's the side that won out, and we kind of see that actually represented here.
Absolutely.
Well, and we've kind of left Beatrice hanging in all of her glory. So I want to read a little bit about his first, witnessing Beatrice for the first time. Time and again at daybreak I have seen the eastern sky glow with a wash of rose, while at the rest hung limpid and serene, and the sun's face rise tempered from its rest, so veiled by vapors that the naked eye could look at it for minutes undistressed. Exactly so, within a cloud of flowers that rose like fountains from the angels' hands and fell about the chariot in showers, a lady came in view, an olive crown wreathed her immaculate veil, her cloak was green, the colors of live flame played on her gown. My soul, such years had passed since last it saw that lady, and stood trembling in her presence, stupefied by the power of holy awe. Now by some power that shone from her above, the reach and witness of my mortal eyes felt the full mastery of enduring love. And so this is his first kind of, not his first encounter with Beatrice, but his him being reunited with Beatrice after all of these years.
Right, 10 years of thirst, as he says. Because she dies in 1290. These events are supposedly taking place on the Easter of 1300, right? So this is 10 years since she passed away. So 10 years that he hasn't seen her. Yeah.
And do we want to say a few things about Beatrice and maybe talk about their relationship? Sure. I know we mentioned it in the first conversation as well. But.
So again, the Commedia, of course, is not the first literary work that Dante composed, way before that, he composes La Vita Nuova, which describes his actual, the first time he met Beatrice. And there we have kind of his first attempt at describing this experience, the feelings that he went through and the intensity of them. And it's a really touching work. It's almost like a diary, right? It feels like a diary because he writes down his, I'm thinking of like teenagers writing down things like okay, first love, all this stuff. Kind of. So it's very, very intimate. It's very personal, and it's very open in terms of how he feels about her. But she struck him from the first. So let me just this is reading from
kind of compare and contrast. This is his kind of first encounter with her.
First encounter, and also his first attempt at writing. Not first attempt at writing, but early attempt at writing. I mean, he wrote poems and things like that before that, but this is one of the earliest larger works that he has. So he says, this is La Vita Nuova, chapter 2. 9 times already since my birth, the heaven of light had circled back to almost the same point when there appeared before my eyes the now glorious lady of my mind, who was called Beatrice, even by those who did not know what her name was. So he's basically saying he was 9 years old when he met her. She had been in this life long enough for the heaven of the fixed stars to be able to move a 12th of a degree to the east at a time. That is, she appeared to me at the beginning of her 9th year. So this is just an elaborate way of saying she was also about 9 years old, maybe just a little bit younger than him. So this is her description. She appeared dressed in the most patrician of colors, a subdued and decorous crimson, her robe bound round and adorned in a style suitable to her years. At that very moment, and I speak the truth, the vital spirit, the one that dwells in the most secret chamber of my heart, began to tremble so violently that even the most minute veins of my body were strangely affected. And trembling, it spoke these words, Ecce Deus fortior mea, qui venies dominabitur mihi. Behold a God stronger than me, who coming will rule over me. At that same point, the animal spirit, the one abiding in the high chamber to which all the senses bring their perceptions, was stricken with amazement, and speaking directly to the spirit of sight, said these words, Apparuit jam beatitude vestra, your blessedness has now appeared. At that point, the natural spirit, in the dwelling in the part where our food is digested, began to weep, and weeping said these words, Heu miser quae frequenter impeditus ero dinceps. Alas, wretched one, for I will often be hindered from now on. So basically, his innermost part of him is like amazed and rejoicing. His emotions are all ecstatic. The only part that's weeping is his bodily part that says, "Oh my God, this guy! I'm going to be hungering. I'm going to be like destitute from now on." So this is the first time. Then the second time he sees her, and this is the most like there's all these famous paintings of this moment. And actually, when I was in Florence last year, I was right at that bridge where supposedly he saw her walking with 2 ladies. So this is that description. After so many days had passed, the precisely 9 years were ending since the appearance just described of this most gracious lady. It happened on the last one of those days, the miraculous lady appeared, dressed in purest white, between 2 ladies of noble bearing, both older than she was. And passing along a certain street, she turned her eyes where I was standing, faint-hearted, and with that indescribable graciousness for which today she is rewarded in eternal life, she greeted me so miraculously that I seemed at that moment to behold the entire range of possible bliss. So she just speaks to him and notices him, and he is in heaven. And at that time, so then what he describes is this vision of the God of love, Amor, appearing to him, and he sees Beatrice lying on a couch and sleeping, and he takes out Dante's heart and starts feeding her this heart, and she's eating it. So this is like next level.
Yeah.
So all that to say that his absolute infatuation with her was complete and total, and he was in love with her from that moment on. And then, of course, what happens is she passes away. She dies. She got married. She married another person. Dante was married, so they never really consummated this love affair. It was purely platonic, right? As we would say now, it was purely platonic. And then she dies, and Dante, at first he feels this crushing weight of sorrow, but naturally time goes on, and then he has these other affections for another lady, another Donna Gentile, another sweet lady, and this is what Beatrice now in Purgatorio is going to berate him for. She's going to berate him that you didn't use the impetus and the force of your affection for me, which meant to be something that should lead you to contemplate God. In fact, you turned around and you followed these lesser false attractions, and therefore you squandered this experience.
Yeah.
And that's why, no, bad.
Yeah, that's great. So the surface kind of meaning is like you weren't faithful to me, you remarried and had sexual relations with other women. But the deeper meaning is more that like you kind of squandered your potential.
Right. It was more that. It was the second, because, I mean, again, they were both married to different people, even while she was alive. So that's not really the problem. The problem is that Dante let, while being married, by the way, he let his affections run in a different direction, and he didn't stay focused on this inspiration, really. That's really, I guess the word I would use is the inspiration. She was his muse. Right. She inspired him. She produced these, the range of all possible bliss in his heart. So what should he have done with that? Well, he should have created something divine, some artwork, some poetry, but he didn't. Until the Commedia is written, nothing is produced of that magnitude. He writes some other philosophical treatise and so forth, but nothing like this. And so she's saying you squandered that potential. Yeah. Now, of course, it's again, we note that after she says this, after this experience, Dante produces, in fact, the most beautiful work of this kind of poetry up until that point. And so it's ironic, but he does fulfill his potential in the end. Yeah. But she's berating him for not doing it at that point.
Yeah. I think also, I mean, there's so much symbolism around purification in Purgatory, obviously, but this is another kind of one, like even after he's, gone through the wall of fire and kind of purified himself, like he's still now kind of confessing to her all of these kind of sins. And so it's another kind of form of, getting the dirt off. Yeah.
He does exactly that. He does confess, and he follows that Catholic formula of confession, contrition, and satisfaction. So he does confess. He agrees with her.
Yeah.
He's contrite. He says, I hate the things that I was doing. I hate them now. They're hateful to me, because he sees her beauty. And that's the real thing. It's not about, it's like, okay, how could I have been so blind, really, is what he's saying.
Well, and then I guess one more of these kind of symbols of baptism is he then actually is kind of bathed in the river Inu. Do we want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, let's talk about both rivers. So we have two rivers. We have Lethe. This is, again, coming straight from the classical tradition, and more specifically, the Aeneid, the underworld in the Aeneid also has Lethe, and you have people kind of crowding to drink from it to forget. It's a river of forgetfulness, right? You just forget, but it's not really filled out what it is you're actually forgetting. Here, it's more specific, where you drink from this and you're forgetting the sins that you committed.
Okay.
Now, before you can forget them, though, you need to confess them, and that's why the rebuke, Beatrice's rebuke, comes before Dante is bathed in Lethe by Matilda, who is this other interesting character. So Dante is bathed in Lethe to forget the sinful life and the sinful habits and so on. But then, so that's the kind of the negative part. But then the positive part is the river Eunoe, like you mentioned. Eunoe is literally means good mind, evnoe, right? Like we have euthanasia, this is, the good mind or the good memory. So you get rid of the bad memories. Now you have renewal, a good mind, a good memory.
Yeah.
So that's the positive one. And so that's the Dante's bathed in both of these rivers. So this is like, yet another baptism. And of course we had the initial baptism when Dante just arrives at Purgatory, when Virgil kind of washes him with this reed, right?
He's watching like hell off of his eyes.
Yes, exactly. To just wash the mist. Yeah, exactly. The mist of hell from his eyes, which is the reed of humility. Yeah. Right? That's the first thing that he needs to do, is kind of humble himself. Just like the reed humbles itself when the wind blows, it kind of bends itself. doesn't break but bends. So, yeah.
Yeah, and then this pretty much takes us to the end here. So he's just been bathed in these two rivers, and just to kind of read the last two stanzas, he says, quote, "I came back from those holiest waters new, remade, reborn, like a sun-wakened tree that spreads new foliage to the spring dew, in sweetest freshness healed of winter's scars, perfect, pure, and ready for the stars."
Beautiful. Yeah, the stars are very prominent in all three canticles. If you remember, just as we emerged from hell, the very last verse of that, of Inferno, was, "And now Dante sees the stars." Hell is starless. There's no heaven. There's nothing like that. And then the first sign that you're out of hell, out of that kingdom of sin and destruction, is that you actually see the stars. And then Purgatorio Canto 1 starts with this beautiful description of the rising, the new day, right, in Purgatorio. Now we finish with, again, we're looking towards the stars. And of course, all of Paradiso is going to be the cosmic journey to the stars.
And that's, I think we'll pick up next time going into Paradise.
Absolutely.
But this was excellent. And like I said, this was my favorite part. I mean, maybe that just tells you something about my psychology. I kind of like the self-improvement genre, and the kind of always trying to get better. And that's what Purgatory is all about. I also thought it was interesting listening to these Great Courses Plus lectures. They went through Dante in the prisons with his inmates. And they said anytime they would finish going through the Commedia, whether it was like in more of a university setting or here, they would ask the students what their favorite part was. And they say usually the college students they were all big fans of Inferno and like all of the spectacle. Said, but the inmates, their favorite part was Purgatory. And, maybe just kind of giving them hope, but they're kind of like very much in that psychology of reform and repentance and whatnot. So I found that interesting too. Cool. All right. Well, great. To be continued.
Absolutely.
All right.
See you in Paradise.
Yes. See you in Paradise. Thanks, Phil. Hey, this is Zach. Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, be sure to follow it so that you get notified every time I release an episode. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, I'd really appreciate if you could take a few seconds to rate the show. This really helps with the algorithm so that more people can discover it. Also, if you would like to get in touch with me or to hear about what's coming up next on the podcast, visit unpackingideas.com/podcast. And there I post links to books and essays that we'll be discussing on future podcast episodes. All right, that's going to do it for today. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next episode.